Good evening. The September 27th meeting of the Roseville Independent Redistricting Commission is called to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Borowak? Here. Cuthbertson?
Here.
Frank?
Here.
Griffith? Here. Ludwig?
Here.
McPhail?
Here.
O'Keefe?
Here.
Sweeney?
Here.
Wagner?
Here.
Waldrop?
Here.
Willoughby?
Here.
Commission alternates Donner?
Here.
Krafka? Kuhn?
Here.
And Slaughter.
Here.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ludwig, please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please rise. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll begin our meeting with public comment. If there's anybody in the audience who would like to speak on an item that is not on the agenda, you're welcome to come forward. Seeing none, the first order of business is approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. The minutes have been distributed. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Okay. If there are no corrections, the minutes are approved.
Hang on, we need to do a motion and a second and all that good stuff for the minutes.
Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move that we accept the minutes from last meeting.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the minutes are approved. Next on the agenda is item number 6.1, reports and presentations.
So we're going to queue up the training. It'll be presented. The commissioner role in your package, you should have the bios of who is going to be presenting this evening. And we'll queue them up in just a second. I see them on the screen. Hopefully they can enlarge it just a little bit. All right, we'll kick it off. You can start your training now.
All right. Chris, do you want to say a word to introduce us?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Chafee. I'm with Redistricting Partners, and we're really happy to be here giving you this training. And the first portion of the training will be led by Connie Malloy, the former chair of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission from 2011, the inaugural commission. She'll be leading a discussion of commissioner roles. And after that presentation, Sophia Garcia, Redistricting Partners Director of Outreach and Map Drawing, will be giving a presentation on the basics of redistricting, something we call our Redistricting 101 presentation. And with that, I will kick it over to Connie Malloy to start her panel.
Great. I'm just checking audio. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. If I could request to have our slides pulled up, that would be great. Okay, wonderful. So my name again is Connie Malloy, and I just recently retired this past summer from a 10-year term on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. Luckily, I don't think any of you will have to play this role for 10 whole years. But it nonetheless, however long it lasts, it's a very significant one in your community. And so we hope that some of our kind of reflections and advice may help as you get moving along the path towards that task. This picture that is on the first slide there was a really significant day for those of us on the inaugural California Commission, in that it was the day that we finalized the maps and that the maps went into their final stage of public viewing before we actually took the final votes. And so I look forward to seeing the picture when you do this in Roseville in the near future. We'll go on to the next slide. So as Chris mentioned, I learned everything I needed to know about redistricting on the California Commission. I knew nothing about redistricting before I was seated on the commission. My background was as an urban planner. I'm currently leading a family foundation. And so I had a number of transferable skills, but really had not realized until the Redistricting Commission opportunity came along what the history really was in the state of California and in many cities and counties on how our electoral districts were drawn. And I certainly wanted to be a part of that process. I felt like it was very important, no matter what your background or your political leaning, that it really felt like one of the building blocks of how we work together as neighbors to build our communities. And so learned so much through that experience. One of my colleagues on the commission, former Commissioner Cynthia Dye, will be joining us today. She also served as one of the chairs of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. And then we'll also be joined by Carlos Marquez, who I believe is already on the line. And Carlos had a similar role to what many of you are playing, which is that he was serving at a local level commission in the city of San Diego. We'll go on to the next slide. Just a little bit more about each of our respective commissions. At the time that Cynthia and I served on the California Commission, it was the first time that in California we had tried this new model. It was the first time that we had a group of everyday citizens that were assigned to do this task. And so we were really, building the plane while flying it. There had been propositions passed, but we had to figure out how to implement the propositions. And we were charged with following a set of voter-approved criteria and also expressly forbidden from looking at incumbency or political party, which had been very much embedded in the process before that. And many people asked, including ourselves, how do you actually do this in a different way? Because it was just so opposed to what the history had been. There were 14 of us. We had 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independents. And quite a range of, occupations, demographics. We even had over a 40-year age spread on the commission at the time that we served. Go on to the next slide, please. Carlos, as I mentioned, was in San Diego, and San Diego has actually been one of the pioneers in the state of California and nationally around the use of independent redistricting commissions. At the time that Carlos sat on the commission, it was also a time that the city was undergoing a significant amount of growth. So not only did they need to redraw the existing boundaries, they actually had to add a seat and do so in a way that really integrated a number of different demographic communities across the city. And I'll let Carlos speak more to that when he joins us. Next slide, please. Of course, it goes without saying, but we're going to just say it, that times have also changed since the last cycle, and in particular, what all of our redistricting commissions and committees and just government servants are having to deal with everywhere is what it is like to run these public processes in a way that balances all of the considerations around, where we're at with COVID and the public's availability and comfort level and safety. And it opens up both some new challenges, but also we think some really interesting opportunities for the way that you'll go about your work. Last slide. So finally, our intention really with this is just to be able to share a bit of reflection. I'll ask a few questions to kick us off, and then would open it up and invite if there are any of you who the conversation sparked something to feel free to go ahead and ask. So with that, we can take down the slides, and I will just kick things off. Good to see you, Cynthia, Carlos, welcome. Would love to just hear from each of your perspectives what motivated you to serve on the redistricting commissions that you did, and what was similar to what you might have anticipated, or what may have been more challenging? I'll start with you, Cynthia.
Thanks, Connie. Well, ever since I took my 5th grade government class and learned about gerrymandering, I was appalled. And I couldn't believe that it was part of a functioning democracy that politicians would choose their voters and not the other way around. And so, when the time came and the initiative in California was proposed to the people, I thought this is a chance to be part of the solution. So that's when I decided to throw my hat in the ring. Once I was selected, and we had a pretty exhaustive selection process at the state level, with 36,000 applicants, winnowing down to the 14 that actually made it on the commission. I think none of us knew exactly what to expect because it was the first time through. And so I think the biggest thing is really how much time it took. And part of it was our challenge. We were actually forming a new state agency on top of learning about redistricting and learning how to work with each other. And all of that was a challenge. And I'm a small business owner, and I had to really juggle my day job obligations with all of this. But it was absolutely worth it, and I wouldn't have given up this experience for anything. And it was an exciting opportunity to be part of the solution to partisan gerrymandering in the state of California.
It's great. How about you, Carlos?
Well, it's great to be with everyone this evening. I was really motivated to apply for appointment to the San Diego Redistricting Commission because I hadn't seen a whole lot of folks from my community represented in public and appointed office. And so I really wanted to do what I could to provide, my community's perspective where possible. And also I worked at a community center, a service provider at the time. And so we did rely on funding from the city, which was drawn down from federal grants called Community Development Block Grants. And that funding provided a range of services from housing to testing to food distribution at a food bank. So I understood the real kind of service delivery impact of having elected officials in office who understand community community conditions on the ground, and that's why I was really motivated to join the commission.
Well, thank you for that. So much of that resonates with my own experience of coming in as a commissioner, and just echoes what we've heard from many of the other commissions that we've spoken to across the state this cycle. In addition, I think now that, because hindsight is 2020, as you reflect back, what do you each believe are some of the values that were important? This type of process is very different than how redistricting has been done in the past. And so you had to chart a new path. And what do you think the values are that are important for redistricting commissions or committees, whatever form it is that they take, to be able to demonstrate to the public? And how do you actually do that in practice? It would be great to get, a real life example, if you might. Cynthia?
Yeah, so in the case of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, we were, of course, very aware that we were a multi-partisan organization that needed to act in a non-partisan way. And it was actually pretty important that we act as a single body, even though we might have disagreements among the commissioners. And so one thing that we did to kind of embody this nonpartisan ethos was to rotate the commission chair. So you heard that both Connie and I were chairs of the commission, and it always rotated to someone from a different party. We felt that was really important for the public to know that it was not partisan and that no party was in control. And then also, despite that, it was also really important that that when we made decisions that, again, we acted as one body. And so we made a rule about making decisions by consensus. So something that surprises a lot of people who learn about the CRC is that we actually rarely took votes. The only things that we actually really voted on were things directly related to approving the final maps, because we needed to have that vote on the record. But instead, what we did is we made sure that everyone had the opportunity to express their point of view. Everyone had the opportunity to influence each other. And when it had been discussed sufficiently and everyone felt like it was pretty obvious what the will of the commission was, we would agree to disagree if we hadn't convinced everyone, and move on with the will of the commission. And that was really effective at making sure different points of view were aired, and yet we acted as one body. Another value was transparency. That was really important. There were actually, constitutional requirements for us to be transparent. So everything, was live streamed on the internet. We had written transcripts that were searchable. We were required to give 14 days, notice for every meeting. So there were a lot of transparency requirements, and we wanted to expose the process of redistricting, which had previously been done in, smoke-filled, dark back rooms. And part of that was also just ensuring there was public access to the commission. So in addition to everyone knowing where we were and, what time the meeting was and exactly what was on the agenda, that also that we provide for language access, for example. So there were meetings where we provided translation, where we knew that English may not be the dominant language. Our website was translated into 6 languages, and our materials also translated into multiple languages. And so we wanted to encourage people to be able to address the commission in a language they were comfortable with, and also that they would get the information back as well. So those were some key values.
A lot of really concrete examples. Thank you for going into that. How about you, Carlos? What values did you find, and particularly given that you're at a similar geographic scale, having come from a local level commission in San Diego?
Well, as you referenced, Connie, one of the things that was unique about San Diego at the time is that it was really the second iteration of this independent commission. And so part of the reason for that is because San Diego had a pretty troubled past when it came to really overt gerrymandering for the purpose of political gain. There was a city council member at the time who drew a lot of the city council district in such a way that would allow him to preserve his ability to run for Congress. Infamously became known as the Filner Finger. And so it was really important for us to be truly independent. And I think that was a value that was a significant organizing principle for our commission. It was a particularly high bar for me because I had worked in politics, I had worked in advocacy, I knew elected officials. And so it was important to enforce the principle of independence, even in my own on my own time. If folks saw me and tried to engage in ex parte communication and things of that nature, or going the extra mile to my calendar so that folks understood that I wasn't engaged in any sidebar conversations. Those were important extra steps to take, again, to reinforce the value of independence. And ultimately, in effect, we were an independent body because we were able to draw the lines and have the final word on those lines. And then the other value that comes to mind is accountability, which seems pretty obvious, but I think accountability to one another is something I would emphasize here for you all. it was, a really incredible opportunity to work with folks from different walks of life and different political stripes in a way that maybe I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do before. Of course, there were points of disagreement and frustration, but we agreed to have one spokesperson on behalf of the commission, which I thought served us really well. So even when we were frustrated or felt like we disagreed with the consensus opinion, we definitely demonstrated very little daylight between us, especially when it came to our communications policy. So the did come under a lot of different instances of scrutiny from the media, and I thought we were served well by having one chief spokesperson, which was our chair, speaking on behalf of the commission with one voice. Otherwise, it can be really undermining to your overall goals as a commission if you've got a number of different spokespeople. So one, I think, tangible takeaway is to pick one person, and of course have the debate about what the message should be and how to update the public on what you're doing, but with one voice.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that theme around all the voices, so you had this approach around consolidating that communication, and then one of the primary roles of all of these committees and commissioner bodies is being able to receive and to hear and to listen to perspectives around what individual community members and collectives, stakeholder groups might think the district lines should look like. And so, the big question I think around that is, how do you take all of those disparate voices and turn them into a cohesive set of maps that feels like it really reconciles and represents the community as best that it can? And, would love your thoughts on that, Cynthia, and then Carlos, and then we'll open it up. I'm really curious what those of you in Roseville are thinking about, and if there's any other specific topics that we can be helpful to you on.
Yeah, so Connie, as you know, this was our the toughest part of our job. After listening and realizing that there were many different ideas on how to draw the lines, and how do we reconcile these differences, and so different people would come and testify about their communities, and we would try to capture those boundaries, and we'd also look for evidence that these were legitimate communities and they had a reason that they needed to be put together for their fair representation, because that's obviously what electoral maps are all about. What we found was that there were many small communities, like Armenians in Los Angeles, or Somali refugees, who've been, relocated to a certain area. And they were relatively small, and so we could capture the boundaries, and we could feel pretty comfortable that we could put them in a set of districts and not split them. So a lot of the smaller communities, it was about making sure we understood them, captured the boundaries, and didn't accidentally split them. But then there were very, very large communities that clearly were going to have to be split due to population. And in our case, we had, multiple levels of districts at the assembly level, the state senate level, and congressional level. And so different size districts. And so in some cases, we could accommodate certain communities in a different size of district. And we tried to understand what their issues were. Are they more federal kinds of issues? Coastal communities, environmental issues, et cetera, that Congress might deal with, or are they issues that were more, would be dealt with by the state legislature, and we have to be more careful about the assembly and the Senate level. You guys aren't going to have those multi-level districts, but you are going to have these conflicts, and the question is, how do you draw the lines in large communities where you're going to have to split them? We actually turned it back to the community in many cases and say, help us understand where is the logical place to split. And they often had a very specific idea, which was very helpful. In one very famous case, we were given conflicting maps by the Asian Pacific Islander community, the African American community, and the Latino community in the South Bay of Los Angeles. It was very difficult to draw. Very diverse, very integrated diversity. And when we looked at the census data, my comment was, wow, this looks like a Jackson Pollock painting, all the different colors based on ethnicity. How are we going to draw fair maps and be fair to each of these communities? And so when we got these different choices, we actually turned it back and asked the representatives of these communities, either we can choose one of these maps and we're going to piss the other folks off, or perhaps you guys could sit down and, tell us what's important, right? And what makes sense to compromise. And they actually, to their credit, went back to the drawing board and talked to each other and discussed it and came back and presented what they called a unity map, which I have to say really made our lives a lot easier because, like I said, we were going to make some people, probably a lot of people, very unhappy. And at the end of the day, I think you're going to have to be comfortable with making people unhappy because that's the truth. This is all going to be about compromise. You're going to make your own judgment about, which communities ought to prevail in certain situations. It's going to be determined by boundary constraints, where you drew the other districts, because they all have ripple effects. But I think working collaboratively with communities to understand if you're going to have to split them, where it's going to be, if they're a smaller community, are there other communities that they'd like to be grouped with because they have similar issues and would want the same representative? These are some of the questions to consider.
Yeah, we balanced a lot of the same considerations at the local level, although we had the added benefit of not having to consider as strictly as the state commission, what degree of deviation we could adopt in the final map in terms of the difference in population from one district to the next. Now, obviously, we couldn't adopt a massively wide range of deviation from one district to another, but we certainly had a little bit more discretion in that regard. And I think we tried to do our best to look at a number of different criteria, which, if you haven't already, you'll learn about with regard to communities of interest, obviously the evidence that the public brought forward to define whatever community of interest they were bringing to our attention. Of course, we would take into consideration any VRA, Voting Rights Act issues that very much needed to be on the list if we were to force rank these criteria. And then, of course, the question of population deviation is very important to consider. But we encountered, a number of issues that were brought to our attention that had nothing to do with the body in which we were attempting to draw boundaries around. We were a commission that was drawing boundaries within a city council, for a city council, right? And there were folks who would issues to us around the concern that, if we drew a city council district in such a way, it would divide up their school district boundaries. It would basically separate their school district into across two different city council districts. And while obviously that's an important consideration around managing drop-off times and traffic congestion, there were some issues that were far more compelling and that we thought if we didn't get right would actually be a direct impact in terms of the governance and the decision-making of the city council and what decisions and policy they actually had a purview over. We also had another example of a district. We were trying to create the first district that would allow the Asian Pacific Islander community to elect a city council member of their own for once in the city's history, a goal that the community organized around and felt very strongly about. And so we were able to create lines to do just that. The problem, of course, they were not terribly happy with the district because by the numbers, it was technically an API empowerment district, at least a plurality of API voters. But part of how we got to the numbers is that it captured a university campus. And so their argument was, well, those folks are hard to turn out to vote. But see, we couldn't, at that point, it's not our job to deliver a perfect voting block to a constituency. It was our job to try to make sure to create the conditions for fairness. And that's what we tried to do. But we had people making very novel arguments about a community of interest. From my community is a community of interest because of the historicity of the houses having been built like 150 years ago, to my community is of interest because we are organized around the quality of life of, or lack thereof, of what the airport and the air quality around the airport, those impacts create for our communities. So you'll get a number of novel, arguments around a community of interest. And the most important thing is, can they support it in the public record? Do they have the evidence to back up their arguments?
Really, really helpful. I feel like I would be such a much better commissioner now, having all this hindsight. I know we have time for a couple of questions. From my screen view, I don't actually see our folks in Roseville. There you are. Want to see if there's any questions. We'd be glad to weigh in.
First of all, thank you very much for that background. It certainly is going to give us an advantage as we go forward. Are there any members of the Roseville Independent Redistricting Commission that would like to be recognized to ask a question?
Chair Frank, just one question from me. Was there any clear evidentiary standard that you applied when people were arguing for their specific community of interest, or was it more subjective in how convincing they could be to tell you that their group of homes was 150 plus years old and therefore they should stay together? Is there any level of it applies or can be applied or not?
That's up to you and your colleagues, right? Because I think you can decide as a commission at the front end to adopt a set of principles and force rank the criteria, and then have some, your operating assumptions are then like, if this, then this. Or it can be a little bit more, responsive to what the public might bring to your attention at any given hearing. Because, some folks would say, well, if we don't have a lot of, if we've not heard from this community historically, then, this is a novel argument, maybe not enough evidence to support it, but also keeping in mind that, a lot of folks who may be participating in this year may not traditionally have had access to these types of proceedings, and you still want to take their perspective into full account.
Does that answer your question?
Well, I think perhaps we can add in also a little bit of context and just some additional ideas to think about. For the state level commission, what we did was we had a sort of template that was to help people as they came to the commission to be able to think about what was the actual structure and content of what would be actionable to the commission. Because when we first started doing the hearings, we heard a lot of interesting things, and a lot of them were just not mappable, so it was, being able to provide people with questions sort of to prompt their thinking. So, for example, who is your community of interest? Describe geographically, where are they located on a map? If you had to designate what the boundaries of how that community is generally thought of, what would be those boundaries? It could be street names, it could be geographic landmarks, etc. And so it was not directive in the sense that it was restrictive. We would still accept testimony that might not exactly follow that formula, but we wanted to do everything we could so that if someone was actually going out of their way to put their time and energy into sharing something with us, that there was a really strong chance that it could be something that we could actually take action upon. We did, though, we also knew that for some people, this was the first time that they might have been engaging in a public process. And so we had to walk a really delicate line around how we would engage with people who were providing information. Because, we had to be fair. We couldn't, spend 30 minutes talking with one person and 2 minutes speaking with another. And so we had to really limit our level of engagement back and forth. There were, honestly, some of our struggles when we were initially getting started was, someone may have given testimony and then, the way that a commissioner might have responded to that testimony in a well-intentioned way of asking for more clarity could have come across as being interrogated. If it's just communicated the wrong way and the person is not, feeling already timid around being providing this testimony, could actually have a chilling effect where they might feel like, oh, maybe my testimony was not as up to par as someone who might have a professional background that would make them really comfortable playing that role. So I think, your community best, and being able to provide an example or a sample or some prompts, but then also just having a really welcoming environment and knowing that there's no two testimonies that are going to come into you the same. And so part of your job is being able to fill in some of those gaps. And if you do get some testimony that seems like there might be some validity to it, but it's not fully fleshed out, where possible, that is also where, you have a really great staff team, I'm sure. You have consultants that you're working with that can also be gathering information on your behalf.
Yeah, and just to give you some other examples, so one of the things we would ask are, in terms of defining the boundaries, are there community centers? Are there churches, rec centers? If you're going to define a community, what are the kind of meeting points and, things that might help us understand the boundary? Like in the case, we also had an airport issue. And there's actually a lot of academic papers written about, pollution corridors around freeways and noise corridors around airports. And so, people would provide this evidence. People would provide information on voting patterns. And of course, don't forget the census, right? So the census provides a lot of basic information, and people would, run reports from the census for their area and show that. But other forms of districts, like school districts, like utility districts, those also were helpful to show like there was some thinking about why these people were grouped this way. So, all of those are data points that can help you decide whether these are legitimate communities of interest and whether the maps that they are proposing actually correspond or not. Environmental groups brought us, maps of watersheds, national park boundaries and local and state park boundaries. There were all kinds of things that, are mapping information that can help you define a community.
Holly, you had a question?
Yeah, I had kind of a comment and just a little bit of a question. Cynthia, I appreciated what you said about the idea of like asking the community to come back with a unity map if we get information, from community of interest that varies slightly. That's not something I would have had on my radar until you mentioned it today. I was like, oh, okay.
Well, they didn't have it on their radar either. They all went to their corners.
Yeah.
And they came up with their own maps. And then, of course, surprise, surprise, they differed.
Uh-huh. So that's something, I wonder if we're going to encounter that in our process. I assume we probably will at some point. But so thank you for mentioning that, because I wouldn't have thought of it myself. And then, let's see. I think that's all I had to say. If I think of a question, I'll come up with it.
We can come back. Sure.
Thank you.
Anybody else with a question?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
here in Roseville, and I'm sure like on the state level and in San Diego, you have to deal with growth and population growth, and that creates a situation in which you have communities of interest that don't even exist right now, and yet we have to make a decision that is going to hold up for the next 10 years. How did you guys deal with that? Because there's water issues, traffic issues, air pollution, all kinds of infrastructures issues that are going to come up within those 10 years. How did you do that at the beginning of your terms? How did you deal with that?
So, I think, so you are, required to draw the maps based on census data. So it is a point in time. And on the other hand, you're put on this commission because you have brains in your heads. And, groups are also going to present information about growth patterns, right? In California, there were pretty dramatic differences in growth patterns in areas that were growing very rapidly and others that were actually shrinking, some certain communities that were shrinking and others that were expanding. And so one of the, I think, most concrete examples I can provide is we were under a lot of pressure to draw a lot of Latino empowerment districts, and Latino majority minority districts, and because of course you're going to have to comply with the Voting Rights Act since it's a federal law, so that's going to be one of your top criteria, and we had to struggle with that as well, and we were actually threatened pretty overtly with a lawsuit from MALDEF, one of the key advocacy organizations, that that they would sue us if we didn't draw enough Latino majority minority districts. And what we did instead, because we were trying to consider all of the other communities in these areas, is we drew a lot of empowerment districts. So Carlos mentioned something similar for the API community in San Diego. So these are districts that are not quite over 50%, but they're a plurality, right? And when we drew those districts, we knew that the demographics were such, based on all the census data and the trends, that they would probably turn into majority minority districts before the end of the decade. So they were like, 47% voting age population or 45%, not 50% plus one that would make them truly majority minority districts. And we did this to comply with all of the other criteria that we at the state were required. We had rank ordered criteria. We had, rules about contiguity and compactness and, other rules besides communities of interest, right, that we had to take into consideration. And we didn't want funny looking districts, of course. And we had to take into account all of the other folks in the area. And so we had nicer looking districts, and we were still able to draw all of these empowerment districts that we pretty much knew within a couple of years, certainly by the midpoint of the decade, that they would probably be majority minority districts. And my measure of success is that we did not get sued by MALDEF. They sued Texas instead. So even though we didn't draw as many districts as they had requested, we had to be really careful, legally, because we wanted the entire map to stand up, all districts to stand up statewide. And so that was how we kind of handled that.
Any questions from any commissioners? I do have a question regarding public participation. Were you surprised, gratified in terms of how much public input there was, or would you have liked to have seen more? Was it too much?
I think we had a good deal of public participation. We went to each, and we had the benefit, obviously, of not living under a pandemic, but we went to each city council district that had existing council district and held at least 2 hearings. I'm sure Cynthia will tell you the same, that once you put a map out, that's really a great catalyzing device for people to come out. Plus, we had already been in the news for a variety of issues. And so people were definitely paying attention. But I would say, don't feel like you've got to wait until everything's, perfect to put that map out, because it certainly does bring people out.
All right, thank you.
I mean, we had crickets in some of our early meetings. Like, we had this massive, I remember some of our first meetings, we had these massive auditorium, at, the state capitol, and it was us and like 3 people in the audience. And then we started doing a lot of outreach and getting the word out, and we, brought on our public information officer and got it going. And then we started seeing more people. But as Carlos said, that magic moment is when you put out a draft map and everyone realizes either how you listened to them or how you misinterpreted what they wanted to say to you, and you will get tons of people at your following meetings to make sure that you get it right.
Yeah, and just this, you may know this already, but certainly because redistricting only happens every 10 years, and it's civics isn't what it once was in our schools by any means, or even in our families. And so part of what your job is, before you can even get to the point of the public having a point of view that they share with you about their districts, is you also have to invest some upfront in that education. And the good thing is there's other things happening that you can really piggyback on. For example, across the whole country, we just went through a census process. Some people, not all, but some people are aware of that process. And so it can be a place of, hey, remember that census data that we were collecting? There's some different things we do with that data. And one of the things we do is we reassess our electoral districts, and this commission is playing a role to do that. So particularly in those early days, you're having to build a sense of understanding or awareness about what redistricting is, and concretely within your community in Roseville, what is the timeline? What are the ways that people can contribute to the process? So being able to think about you as individuals in your community who have your own, networks, that, the visibility you might be able to bring, the role that your staff and your consultants can play to help get the word out is going to be what helps to get more participation in the process.
All right. Thank you. Are there any other questions from commissioners regarding this presentation?
I'd like to make a comment.
Sure, Sonia.
In generality, we were talking about growth. The charter in the city of Roseville states that we will only have 5 districts. And so within that, it's not like we can take a growth area and split it in half, because we only have 5 city council members as dictated by the charter. So we'll have to make our districts 5 districts. If we wanted to expand the number of council members, that would be a charter amendment, which would have to go to the voters prior to the map adoption, and we don't have that opportunity during this redistricting process.
All right, thank you.
And that's actually no different than the challenge we had at the state level, that we have, 80 assembly members and we have 40, senators, and, those California state Senate districts, bigger than our congressional districts, bigger than a lot of states, because we are limited with the number of districts.
All right, we have a question.
So we are seeing deviation in some of the information we've been provided. What is the extreme deviation that you were allowed in your work?
So what was the deviation that you were allowed in drawing the maps and the work that you were doing?
Carlos, you should probably take this one.
So I think our deviation didn't go any more than 0.5. It wasn't. I think that's much more than I think what the state would be allowed to do, but it was allowable at the local level.
You mean 5%, right?
Actually, half of 1%.
So
that's actually really tight.
Yeah, just to jump in really quick. So on the local level, you actually have a total deviation of 10% allowable by the courts and by the judgments. So you do have that's the tool that you can use, and it will bring it up when Sophia gives her Redistricting 101 presentation a little bit later. Is that local jurisdictional tool of 10%? Congressional deviations is one person difference. And basically the state commission, I can't remember what you guys set your total deviation for last time, but the state commission has the authority to set their target deviation. So there's multiple answers to that question, depending on what jurisdiction you're looking at.
Yeah, back to our state Senate districts and how big they are, like almost 1 million people. We ended up setting our deviation to be quite tight because, 0.5% of 1 million people is a lot of people, right? So we ended up having, I think our final deviation was plus or minus 0.5%. Is that right, Connie? Do you remember?
Mm-hmm. That rings a bell, but yes, it's been a little while. And I think it evolved very much. I mean, when we first started having the conversations around deviation, I think we had a lot of purists on our, you kind of, if you know anything about redistricting, what you hear is one person, one vote, and really wanting to be diligent in executing what that looks like in the maps. And then as you actually work through the complexity of the different criteria that you have to balance, you can actually start to see some of the trade-offs where you might actually get to minimal to no deviation, but you may cause some unintended consequences that on the whole are going to cause some challenges in the community. And so really it's an important policy discussion to have, and it is one of the tools that you have available to you, particularly at the local level, is some additional flexibility there.
All right, thank you. And Holly, did you remember your question by any chance? No? Okay. So is there anything more to that part of the presentation that you'd like to add before I open it up to public comment and questions?
Not at all. Thank you so much for your time. We are really honored to support your process and grateful for your service. And so if we can continue to be a resource, we will be cheering you on.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder, there is another presentation after this, but if anybody from the public would like to ask a question or make a comment regarding Connie, Cynthia, and Carlos's previous presentation, please state your name and your residence.
Hi there, Lisa Larkin, Roseville. I've lived here since 2000. I just wanted to make a general comment about these meetings and public participation. I know that seems to be the reason that we're having these. And I actually was late for the initial public comment because I joined online and then didn't realize there wasn't a number to call in to make public comment. And I do know there's another person at home that's watching that would have been interested in making public comment but didn't have that opportunity. So also, as well as potentially providing Zoom links, if there is going to be Zoom, that people can join to listen in, that would give more participation. I recognize a few of you that participated heavily in the last redistricting. I was one of them, and the public did participate. A great deal of people did. I don't even remember how many maps were submitted, but there were a lot of maps submitted. And in the end, we were talking, the trainers were just talking about, the public coming to a consensus on a particular map. And we did narrow those maps down. And there was actually 100% support for a map 106, which had clean boundaries, met all the criteria. And at the last minute, a new map was thrown in, 117B, which is the map that we currently have that's clearly gerrymandered from the public point of view. And when you have the public participate like they did, and then to have every bit of their participation blown away by the city council members picking a map that kept them in their seats, that's a turnoff. And you're not going to get public participation if you're not listening to the public. And so I'm very grateful. We're part of the reason that you guys are here is we fought for that. We came in and wanted that. In fact, Sonia mentioned, being able to expand from 5 districts. And that was brought up. When those charter commission meetings were going on, we brought it up. And the Roseville city council members, I believe, if I remember right, voted against changing the number or even giving the option to increase the number of districts when we had this last election. So considering all that, we would just my comment mainly here is to make it a little bit more accessible for the members of the public. We still have a COVID situation on. We still have people that, we have a lot of senior communities that aren't going to come here to speak publicly, and it would be nice to have a telephone number for them to call in. And then I'm grateful that you opened this up, because I noticed there wasn't a public comment section here. It was in the very beginning. And one of those members said by 6:02, you were already past it. So if you're a few minutes late to the meeting, they didn't get an opportunity to do that. So we just asked for that. Thank you.
And just to clarify, is there a telephone number for public comment?
Showing on the screen right now.
Okay. And that was available earlier also?
Well, there was a decision made via a assembly bill that was passed that now that we're back to regular meetings, the city council, that all the commissions should follow that as well. And that dictates that if we're having live meetings, that people come participate at the meetings in the chambers, and eventually the phone number is going to be done away with.
If we want to have the phone number, can we, or are we prohibited?
In order to create consistency between all the boards and commissions, I think it would be a disservice to the public for some to have the phone number and some not to have the phone number. So that's something that we can bring to the executive team and ask for their opinion on that. I can do that for you.
Any questions on that point?
Yeah, I have a couple questions just after listening to the comment from Ms. Larkin. What is being posted or pushed out? Because is it going on the main Roseville city calendar? I know even I sometimes find a hard time seeing information about this commission posted more publicly.
If you go visit the website, there is a radio button on the front page. Yeah. And if you click on that, it tells the whole story about why we're doing redistricting. Yeah. It lists all the council, all the packet information on there. So that will be an ongoing update to that particular page. When draft maps are brought before that, we'll post the maps on that page. So there's a real focus to provide that information. And our Public Affairs and Communications Department has done a fantastic job getting that page up and running.
But specifically on the city calendar, so like when you go to see like meetings and agendas, there's like a general city calendar?
It's on there. The meeting agendas are on there in the packets.
Okay, and ours is listed?
Correct.
And then my...
And just a reminder, we're in public comment
for
this.
So can I ask a question? Can I comment on the questions or things that she posed?
Can I follow up on that? Because I looked for the meeting under the city, or the Roseville City Council agendas, which is where I would have expected to find it. I didn't find it. I had to actually search for Roseville redistricting to get the meeting, and it brought up a YouTube channel. That's what it brought up.
It is on the city website as well.
I pulled it from the city website today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's under agendas and minutes.
It's definitely on the city website. It's just a matter of, is it consistently in all of the places that city council meetings are on, charter reviews?
Yes.
Because I do think that there have been some instances where it's not. I'll do some homework on that specifically and send some screenshots.
If you go to the city website and go to agendas and minutes, click on that, click on all meetings.
Oh, this is great. Yeah, because there's a calendar usually that you can like go and see. Oh, great, that one's
Brian,
on
can
there.
you go down to agendas and minutes? Click on that. And then do all meetings on the far left. And then search down and you should see the Redistricting Commission meeting there.
Great.
And it's being streamed right now, and there's the agenda on the city webpage.
Perfect.
And I do think it's helpful to get feedback from the public on this, because I know sometimes if I'm looking for something I can't find it, my son can pick it up real quick. Somehow he knows how to do it. And so just being able to look at it with a different set of eyes is always helpful. And then I don't know if the PIO can give a brief presentation to us about all the different things and allow us to provide some feedback and suggestions as well at some point.
Well, I'd just like to say that item 6.5 in tonight's packet is talking about the whole engagement process. And it's going to be very detailed. And and extensive. And the public outreach, we're going to have mailers. I mean, I'm kind of stealing the show for later, but there's going to be mailers and all the utility bills and mailers sent to all the residents. So right now we're in training mode, and the engagement to the public is going to become much more robust very soon.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move forward, unless there's any other questions from commissioners, to 6.2, which is continuation. It's continuation of Redistricting 101. And again, just thank you, Connie, Carlos, and Cynthia for your earlier presentation. Now, in the agenda, I believe it has Paul Mitchell as providing the presentation, but I think we have somebody different. Is it Sophia or is it still Paul?
I believe it's not Paul. I believe it's Sophia, and I think Brian's going to bring that up now.
All right, Sophia, take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'll wait till the staff brings up the presentation. Wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia Garcia. I am the GIS and Outreach Director with Redistricting Partners. So throughout this redistricting process, and we've already seen a number of the Redistricting Partners team with us earlier this evening, and throughout the process, you'll continue to meet a lot of us, and we're really excited to be here. We've already had some wonderful comments from the public, and so this is the Redistricting 101 presentation, and we'll go to the next slide, please. So an overview of the process this evening, we will go over a range of topics. So please ask us your questions, note them. Hopefully we'll be able to get through all of them at the end of the presentation. We'll be talking about the process under the Fair Maps Act. This is a new California law that has come into play for the redistricting cycle for the first time. So there's some new process laws and additional requirements that the commission will have to adhere to. We'll talk about an overview of what is redistricting, and we will go into state and federal Voting Rights Act laws. We'll give an example and talk through gerrymandering, which is something that a lot of people think about when they hear redistricting. We will go over the census data for your city. We'll talk about the timeline that we have for your meetings. And then also we have the current demographic data by district. So we have quite a bit to get through this evening. So let's get started. We'll go to the next slide, which is focused on the Fair Maps Act. So the next slide, please. So the Fair Maps Act, otherwise known as AB 849, if you want to Google it on the California state website, it is a requirement for cities and counties across the state of California. And again, this is a new law that is coming into effect for the first time for the 2021 cycle. We have an additional slide later on in the presentation that talks about some more requirements, but the ones for the process that we have under the Fair Maps Act are that the commission must hold 1 to 2 pre-map hearings to collect communities of interest testimony. So these are hearings that we're not talking about draft maps. The commission isn't discussing any maps. It's purely for community of interest testimony to hear what members of your community would like to see during this process. Then you must hold 2 hearings to only discuss the maps. So the commission can talk about those. We can hear again comments from members of the public about those maps, and then a final hearing for the adoption to pass the maps. There is a requirement for the adoption of the final map that map be posted 7 days prior. We're also going to work with staff, and then in your city charter, you also have that where it's a 30-day posting to allow for members of the public to comment, and we will adhere to that spirit of transparency throughout the process to try to post the maps and anything around redistricting prior to a meeting. You are welcome as a commission to add more meetings onto this process, but under the law, you have to hold at least 4 hearings. So we'll go to the next slide. And the next slide, so now we're talking about redistricting, an overview of it. So redistricting, something that happens 10 years, every 10 years, every year after the census. And it, at its core, is about equalizing population among districts. So it does happen after the census, after we get that data. And in a normal year, without the COVID, without the pandemic, we would have received that data earlier at the end of March, but this is, we're in abnormal times. And so we just got that data a couple of weeks ago. So we are operating under a more compressed timeline than we would have been in another situation. So it's also important during this process to meet two key requirements, one constitutional and one from the Supreme Court. We've already heard one of these mentioned tonight, which is the one person, one vote, which is the equal ability to elect a candidate of choice, and then also equal representation under the 14th Amendment, which is to create districts and thinking about how effective any resident can be at advocating for themselves or being represented within a jurisdiction. Again, these are some of the two key requirements and why we do this after the release of the census data, once we have that compiled. I'll go to the next slide. And we're going to, the next slide, so State and Federal Voting Rights Act. So for the Federal Voting Rights Act, it seeks to remedy racial disenfranchisement. Again, this was mentioned earlier by our speakers, and there are two key sections impacting redistricting nationwide. The first one is majority minority districts, which is still in play. That's known as Section 2. And then Section 5, the pre-clearance rule has been inactive since 2013. So to draw Section 2 districts under the Voting Rights Act, we will rely on legal counsel who will let us know if we need to draw Voting Rights Act districts or majority minority districts. And then the California Voting Rights Act is a little different. It prohibits the use of at-large election systems in local government if there is racially polarized voting. And in Roseville, since you are already a districted system, this doesn't apply to your city. So we'll go to the next slide. So we'll talk a little bit, we have a slide a little bit more on that Section 2 and its enforcement. So the first thing is a minority group must be sufficiently large and geographically compact to comprise a majority of the districts. Again, this analysis will come if legal counsel goes forward and does that racially polarized voting. The second is a minority group must be politically cohesive and must demonstrate a pattern of voting for the same candidate, also known as a block voting. And the third is a majority of voters vote sufficiently as a block, usually to defeat the minorities group preferred candidate. So it's just a little bit more in depth on Section 2 and the requirements we'd have to follow if we would need to draw those specific districts. So we'll go to the next slide. So determining Section 2 obligation requires legal counsel and sometimes a racially polarized voting analysis. So some of the questions that we'd have to ask are, does the minority population qualify under Section 2? Is the proposed district a sufficient remedy? In other words, is it an effective minority or majority minority district? Again, we kind of heard this concept talked about earlier today, whether to draw a district that's 47% of under a minority population or do the 51 plus. Another one is there a claim for a coalition district, which Cynthia talked about a little bit. And then without Section 2, another thing I think for the members of the public to know is that without Section 2, a community of interest can still be supported, but race cannot be a predominant factor in drawing districts. So this one is kind of a pretty important concept, especially if Roseville will not be drawing Section 2 districts, is that race can be a community of interest. It can be something that you as a commission can hear, but unless you need to draw Section 2 districts, it cannot be the predominant factor in drawing districts. So that's something that we talk a little bit more in depth on our outreach presentations. So we'll go to the next slide. So So we're going into the concept of gerrymandering, and so we just want to get it out there and talk about it. We'll go to the next slide. So the term gerrymandering it's over 100 years old. It's a term that came from a cartoon depicting this kind of serpent-looking district in Massachusetts. And Governor Elbridge Gerry wasn't the person who drew the district, but he was the one to sign it into law. So this is kind of where we get that concept from. So people may be thinking it's a concept that happened 100 years ago. It doesn't happen. And we'll go to the next slide. But it still happens today. We've seen, and this is a California Senate district from 2001, and it is actually one of the districts that became an example of why we have the California Independent Redistricting Commission today, which is why California residents voted for that to take the power of finalizing maps out of the hands of elected officials and into the hands of members of the public, very similar to who we're speaking to today with the Roseville Commission. So this is something that a lot of members of the public and folks who are in the redistricting process are trying to get away from this term of gerrymandering and move to more districts that are transparent and supported by the public. So we'll go to the next slide. Here we have a little example because, again, we've heard, again, earlier today that folks kind of learn about redistricting in a very general term and hear gerrymandering and kind of have the two, conflate them as being the same thing. So how does gerrymandering work? You can kind of, as an example, start with these 9 triangles with 5 being yellow, 4 being green. So if we've at first glance, maybe we're going to draw 3 districts. We'll go to the next slide. This could be an example. If you just simply draw 3 districts horizontally, great. You have 2 majority yellow districts, 1 majority green. But if we think about maybe how can we gerrymander these districts to have 2 green districts, your districts may look like, we'll go to the next slide, may look like this. So now you have 2 majority green districts and 1 majority yellow. So there are ways where you can draw lines to advantage or disadvantage a particular population, but we'll go to the next slide to talk through some of the specific gerrymandering. And it looks a little, this slide looks a little fuzzy. Does that look like it to you?
Nope.
Okay. Sorry, on my end it looks a little fuzzy, so I have the presentation up on my side. Apologies, I just want to make sure I don't get things wrong. So there are 2 primary types of gerrymandering, racial and partisan, but are many more ways that gerrymandering can occur throughout this redistricting process. So partisan gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has currently determined that this is non-justiciable, but some states and local laws have stepped in to ban them. Under the Fair Maps Act, they have done work where partisanship cannot be a community of interest, and we'll talk about that in a later slide. Racial gerrymandering has been repeatedly found to be unlawful by courts. And incumbent gerrymandering is very common, but again, under the Fair Maps Act, incumbency cannot be considered as a community of interest. So in California, we have taken steps to try to deter districts or governing bodies from making districts that are gerrymandered. So we'll go to the next slide. The next slide. So now we're going to get into the traditional redistricting principles, which are guiding principles, and they are principles here to help prevent districts from becoming a gerrymander. These are principles that are used across the country, and they're actually the principles that are under the Fair Maps Act as well. So we're going to go one by one. And so we'll go to the next slide. And the next slide to start with equal population. So for equal population, as we said a little bit earlier, we utilize U.S. decennial census data, and we utilize the census data, but we also use census geography. So we will use census blocks as our base geography for any draft maps and for the final map as well. We don't split census blocks, so as we're using any online mapping software or giving you any draft maps or the final map, there may be some geography that looks a little different and may not as neat, but we do that because we have to use that census geography, which is the census blocks. So equal population has been a key subject in redistricting litigation. The concept of population equality is based on people, not citizens. Again, going back to using the decennial census file, we are not talking about citizenship. We are looking at that total population, which is people. So that's one big key element for this criteria of equal population. The second is the metric, which is called deviation, which also has been discussed a little today, which is the measure of how close a district is to equal size, or the ideal kind of population size of your districts. In this case, it would be your total population divided by 5. And we'll go to the next slide, which goes a little bit more in depth and kind of elevates that conversation that Connie, Cynthia, Carlos, and Chris was having in the earlier portion of this meeting. And so for local governments, for the city of Roseville, you have an allowable total plan deviation of 10%. So you are able to utilize up to 10% of the plan deviation, which means that you can have a district that is negative 5% and positive 5%, or negative 2% and positive 8%. That's your plan deviation. And as Chris was kind of saying, that we have this deviation here because this is a ranked criteria order. So let's say there is a community of interest that you as a commission decide to remain intact, and then that will have you go, closer to that 10%. And just something that we like to let cities and other clients know is that you don't necessarily have to strict yourself from having a less than a 10% deviation, because we say it's a fallacy that to try to hold yourselves accountable to a smaller number may mean a better redistricting process, and that's not necessarily the case. So you can choose to have a lower deviation, but that may not, may down the line, you may come in conflict with then having to split a neighborhood or split a community of interest. So again, your allowable deviation is that 10%, and we'll have that deviation for you for any draft map that is being discussed. We'll have the breakdown of the districts and the total plan deviation, which we will also see in the later slides. So we'll go to the next slide. So equal population, again, equality is required. And again, as I said, a strict adherence to a numeric goal for equality beyond what is required is not, again, necessarily better. So we'll go to the next slide. We'll talk about the next principles. So we'll go to the next slide. And again, these redistricting principles are in ranked order, and they are in the Fair Maps Act. And contiguity is one of those terms that we also kind of hear once a decade, but what it means is to have your districts be geographically contained or similar, but you can also think about this in two different ways. So there's literal contiguity, where you look on a map and your district seems whole and together. And there's also functional contiguity, which means that functionally, how does a district work? So in the city of Davis, we have a district that's on the southeast portion of the city, and that was the only way that it kind of made sense to draw that district, because there was a railway, and the only two ways that you could get to the other side of the city were to drive either east or west of the city boundaries. So that was a district that was drawn based on functional contiguity. So in your city, if you can also think about it again as literally, but also functionally, how do you, your residents in the community, move between districts, move between neighborhoods and communities? And so that's something that that can be discussed within the commission. So we'll go to the next slide, which is communities of interest. We'll go to the next slide. So maintaining communities of interest is another one of those phrases that comes up once a decade, but at its core, what it means and why we have it here in redistricting, and also it's one of the larger topics of conversation throughout this particular redistricting cycle, is that it's recognizing that members of the community are experts of your community. You know, again, how you functionally move throughout the city of Roseville, what neighborhoods are similar, which areas that you visit the most, or your community interacts with the most. And so it is uplifting that community engagement process in the redistricting cycle. So it's about bringing like-minded people together for representation. And a community of interest can include ethnic and language minorities, and can also be a large number of examples. Last week, I was at another city's public hearing where there was 7 hours of public comment given on the topic of a rent control ordinance, and I listened to testimony from landowners and lots of testimony from renters and tenants. And it was a wonderful example of communities of interest who were competing communities of interest, and it was the job of that board to kind of come to consensus on what they wanted to do moving forward. So you can also hear competing communities of interest, and the commission will then have to discuss and decide how they will draft their maps and then finalize their map too. But it was a wonderful meeting, hearing very, very passionate people, and we hope that the same for you all throughout this process. So we'll go to the next slide. So we have 3 kind of questions that we like to kind of frame community of interest and help members of the public when they're thinking about giving testimony. Again, while we understand that community experiences and how we interact with our city, it's very subjective, and all of us will come forward with different testimony, but we are talking about community testimony for a redistricting cycle and for the city of Roseville. So there are some criteria. There are state and federal laws that the commission will have to follow. So these 3 kind of themes are things that, again, will help the public kind of hone in on testimony that makes sense for the commission to listen to and ultimately, hopefully, use during the process. So the first one is groups with shared culture or characteristics. So what are the kind of bonds that tie your community together? Once you've kind of thought through that, thinking through its ability to be mapped. So what is the geography of the community you'd like to share? Are there street boundaries? Is there a specific location? This one is really important, especially when folks are coming forward to give verbal testimony or written comment, because of course, if someone submits a map to the commission, we're able to see kind of the boundaries that the member of the public has outlined themselves. But if you're giving verbal or written testimony, we want to make sure that we're not misinterpreting what you are outlining as your community of interest. So there's sort of it's helpful to give us specific street names, geographies, or neighborhood names. The second thing, again, because this is a testimony for a redistricting commission, is to think through what is your community's relationship to the agency and its policies. So in this case, asking yourself, what is your community's relationship to the City Council of Roseville, and how you would benefit from having your community be kept together, or maybe right now your community is fractured in multiple districts, and how has that affected you negatively or positively? Again, these are the 3 things that we have found to help folks think through as they're giving their testimony. So we'll go to the next slide. And the next slide. So under the Fair Maps Act, it says for protecting cities and census designated places or other kind of government geographies is to the extent practicable, the geographic integrity of a city or census designated place shall be respected in a manner that minimizes its division. So I think we heard mentioned like school districts was mentioned earlier, or like water districts or fire districts. If there's other kind of existing government lines out there that the commission or the public thinks would be applicable to review and think through this process, there is the ability for the commission to look at that and consider those as additional criteria to look at. So we'll go to the next slide. And the next slide to talk about compactness. So determining what is quote unquote compact. So the measure of compactness itself can get pretty complicated. You can do the ratio of the circumference of the district. You can measure the number of straight lines. There's been some jurisdictions who have just simply outlawed any districts that have funny shapes, but we'll go to the next slide. But in California, we have a rather elegant or simple definition that we can use, which is to not bypass nearby population in favor of more distant populated areas. So if there is population that is nearby the district that you're trying to draw, but you kind of move around some streets to grab other population, that will not be allowable under this definition of compactness. Another thing, just for the public to know and the commission to know, is just because we may have a draft map or a final map with a district that looks a little funny, doesn't necessarily mean that that district or the plan has been gerrymandered. It may mean that the commission has decided to keep a neighborhood together or a community of interest together, or rely on testimony for the way that they'd like to draw a map. So again, keeping that in mind, because compactness is a lower criteria in the principles that we have and that the commission will have to follow. So we'll go to the next slide. So here's additional rules and additional criteria that the city of Roseville will need to follow beyond those traditional ones that we just reviewed. Again, it's called the Fair Maps Act, or AB 849. And some more of the criteria is that incumbency and candidates cannot be considered as community of interest, nor can political party affiliation be considered as community of interest. So what does this mean practically? Is that if a member of the public came forward and talked about incumbency, talked about candidates, talked about political party, the commission will be disallowed from using that testimony as a community of interest. So we understand that members of the public, it's your right to come forward and give testimony to those who represent you. However, the commission has to follow state laws and federal laws during this process. And under a state law, they will be disallowed from considering those specific criteria as testimony for the purpose of the City of Roseville redistricting process. Another criteria is that you must hold a minimum set of hearings to encourage public engagement, which we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. Those hearings must also be at a set time on your agenda. So if there were, this one is really there for when a non-redistricting commission is holding a meeting, but you will have to have all of your things at a set time. You'll have to have your meetings at different times so that they're accessible to members of the public. And as we talked about earlier, thank you for staff for bringing up that there is a specific City of Roseville redistricting website, and that redistricting website will be maintained for a decade. So all of the redistricting content, meetings, this recorded presentation, any draft maps that are submitted by the public, any maps that are discussed by the commission will be posted on that specific redistricting website, and it will be maintained for a decade. So if anybody in 2025 is missing what happened during this amazing redistricting process, you can go back to that website and look at all the work that we've done. So those are some of those additional rules under the Fair Maps Act. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we are under a more compressed timeline. With the census coming late, it makes our process a little bit more complicated, but the current deadline for final passage of plans with the City of Roseville is December 15th, as set forth in the Fair Maps Act. The deadline may be subject to change, but we are operating that it is December 15th, and we need to proceed, again, under the presumption that it's not going to be changing. We'll update you with anything that comes forward, but just so members of the public know, the commission is really operating under this really compressed timeline. So we will, again, post everything, all the meetings and information there, but it is due to the late census that everyone across the board is just kind of doing their work at similar time that a lot of other jurisdictions are.
Sophia, can I make a clarification? The September 15th deadline is for counties. The deadline for cities is an April timeline, and we are actually going to have our map adopted by February 1st. So we don't fall within the September 15th deadline.
You mean December?
I'm sorry.
And actually Sophia, sorry, there's actually a slide coming up with your timeline. I think this is sorry, we should have changed this slide. It's on us.
Okay, so since you don't have the primary, then it's in April. Apologies, and we will update that so that the correct presentation is on the website. So discard that. But for other cities, that is their deadline. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you for jumping in for that clarification, that much needed clarification. So now we'll talk about the census data, and we'll go to the next slide. So for the mechanics of redistricting, we use the census data, which is the called the PL94 file, but we also use the geography. So again, that's the underlying framework of our census data, and it comes kind of layered. So a lot of folks in California are really have become really similar to census tracts, which is the geography that was used for folks who did census outreach. But for redistricting, the kind of underlying geography that we want everybody to know and become fluent in and to talk a lot about are census blocks. So those are the smallest unit of geography that we get from the census. It's the unit of geography that we'll be using for the City of Roseville redistricting. And again, we do not split census blocks because if we think back to that first criteria of equal population, it's based on census data. And if we split blocks, we wouldn't know or use the true census data on there. It is a point in time count, so we have to use the data that we've had from April 1 of 2020. There are also data out there for multi-year averages, so for any kind of supplemental information like the rental data, homeowner data, or the data set that we'd use for Voting Rights Act data, which is the citizen voting age population, that will come in the American Community Survey, but for the purposes of drawing districts, that is that decennial census file. We'll go to the next slide, please. So this is a really cool graphic. It makes the census and this data, I think, look really fun. So the geography for the files that we use are called TIGER files, and it stands for Topological Integrated Geographic Encoding and Referencing, but we just call them TIGER files. Again, that's nested geographic units, beginning with blocks, moving up to block groups, and then finally we have those larger tracts. And we're going to show you an example of those in the next slide. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So starting from left, we have the census blocks, which are the smallest unit of geography, and they have the, each of these have the number on them. Then you go up to census block groups, and then finally census tracts is the largest nested geography. So folks will have the ability, you can look at them in the different census hierarchy, but again, if we're using a mapping software or any draft maps that we give you will be the base of those census blocks. So we'll go to the next slide, which will give you more zoomed in version. So each of these, you can kind of see there's quite a few with zeros in them, but you have some that have 245 or just have that geography of the total for that census block. And we'll go to the next slide, and the numbers will be a little bit easier to read for those block groups. And then finally, the next slide is the census tract, which again, a lot of people across California have become familiar with census tracts due to the 2020 census hard to count kind of effort that a lot of folks were involved in. So we'll go to the next slide. So there are two different data sets most commonly used in redistricting. Again, the PL 94-171 is that decennial census file, and that gives us the census block geography. It also gives us the total population count for April 1, 2020. And it is normally required to be released before April 1, 2021, but it was delayed this year until the end of August. We did get a legacy file format data at the end of September. And what that was is, if you kind of think of IKEA furniture and you buy the thing from IKEA, you have all the pieces, but you have to put it together yourself versus buying the piece itself that's already made, the chair or whatever you're buying. And that's what the legacy data was, is that it is the true 2020 census file, but we at Redistricting Partners did the back end work to have it in the format that it normally comes in. And so that was the final release in August, which was I have those dates mixed up, which was the later date that the census was released. Chris, I don't know if you want to jump in and give the specific dates for when those were released, so public can have it on file.
Yeah, so the legacy file was released on August 12th. And then I think one thing, not to confuse matters at all, but we finally got the final data set for all cities and counties in California from the statewide database on September 20th, so last week. And this is the prisoner reallocated data set that is mandated under the Fair Maps Act for all cities and counties to use. So the data and the maps that Sophia will be presenting in 4 or 5 slides from now, I think, will be that data set and showing your current lines with the final data that we have, so you can understand kind of what, if you wanted to, starting from your current lines, what the deviations would be with this new data set. And just as a spoiler, Roseville's grown a lot in 10 years, so your deviations are quite high. But since Sophia will get into that in a couple more slides.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for jumping in. I just want to make sure we had the correct dates for those. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is talking about what Chris just mentioned, and is something that is newer and is California focused. It's the statewide prisoner reallocation data set, which is the final data set that the city commission will be utilizing for their process. It is done by the California statewide database out of UC Berkeley. And so they take the 2020 decennial census data and adjust it based on the state prison population and reallocate them based on their last known address before they were incarcerated. This is something that was passed to allow for more equitable redistricting. So prior to this being part of our process, any city or county that had a state prison, that incarcerated population would be counted as their total for their redistricting process. And now we are removing that from the specific location of where that prison is to reallocating them across the state. So that is also a newer updated data set from our previous process. So we'll go to the next slide. Again, I referenced the American Community Survey is the estimated data that gives more context and more information on the demographics of your area and the socioeconomic information. This isn't a data set that everyone gets. I believe it's 1 in 100. Is that correct, Chris? Yeah, 1 in 100 people in your community will receive this, a longer form of the census survey, and that is where we get the citizen voting age population, which is again something we would use if we were creating Section 2 districts. And that is a data set that a lot of folks are understanding a lot more again through this process. So we'll go to the next slide, which will talk through the timeline, and we'll go to the next slide. So this is a timeline that was thought through with the city, the commission, and Flow Analytics. So it's beginning in September with the California Adjusted Census Data release. So wonderful, we have that specific date there, all the way to the final plan, which will be adopted February 23rd. So again, my correction, the final date for the city of Roseville is not December 15th, which a lot of other cities are. It is February 23rd. Again, thank you for that correction. It's important that we all have the specific information. And so this is a wonderful timeline that you can look at to think and see where we are throughout the process. And right now, we are here giving the first training to the city. So a great resource for members of the public who'd like to be involved and come forward with any testimony. So we'll go to the next slide, please. And the next slide, where we're going to get into your specific information. So this is an overview map that for the city of Roseville showing the 2021 districts. And the way that you see all of these maps and the data breakdown will be how we treat any maps that are submitted by the public and any draft maps and the final plan. So you will see it with these colors, with the numbers of the districts. Sometimes we'll use letters of the districts, specifically when we're doing draft maps, to again let the public know that it's a draft map and not a final plan. And so we'll go to the next slide. And this slide gives you the breakdown of how the 2021 districts compare to 2020 census data, along with the citizen voting age population data. So as Chris said, there is a lot of growth in the city of Roseville, specifically in District 5. I think a commissioner was referencing this earlier, is that the total plan deviation, looking at the 2010 census data against the 2020 census data, you have a much larger deviation than what would be allowable, over a 45% deviation. So again, for every plan that is discussed or reviewed, you will have this this breakdown of it. And we do the Latino, Asian, and Black population, because those are the populations that in California, if we were to draw a Voting Rights Act districts, it would be of one of those 3 subgroups. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a focus on District 1. So again, we have the specific breakdown of population, total CVAP, and then on the right side, you'll see the 2020 census data with the citizen voting age population data in a graph. And then on the bottom right, kind of an overview of where it is for the whole district. So for this specific district, if we look at it and sort of think through that third criteria of compactness, this specific district would not be allowable for this process because it kind of bypasses the population on the left and goes up to the top left corner. So again, this is a wonderful example of what was allowable under state and federal law in 2011 and what would be disallowed through this process in 2021. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Looking at District 2, again, we have the kind of that same breakdown with the population and CVAP. And we'll go to the next slide, please. District 3, large growth across the whole city of Roseville. And we'll go to District 4, where we see again, just a wonderful kind of example of looking at what happened in 2011. And I think all of us are waiting to kind of look at District 5 with that large deviation in there. So we have, again, the deviation that is over 45%. So there's the specific district deviation, and for this one it is 45.8%, and the total plan deviation would be adding the 45.8 plus what was happening, or any district that is underpopulated. So I know we talked about deviation earlier, and so you have the specific district deviation, and then you have the total plan deviation, and you have an allowable deviation of 10% with the total plan deviation. And so that's our last slide, but we can go to the last to see the logo. So Chris just calculated, and right now the total plan deviation of your current districts is 62.7%. So quite above what is allowed. So excited to kind of work through those changes with you and the commission. So that's what we have. So I can give it back to staff to field any questions from the commission.
Thank you, Sophia. At this point, I want to invite any of the commissioners if they have any questions on the presentation. Okay, then I will open it up to questions from the public on this presentation. Checking the phone lines on this one, or no? Okay. Seeing no commissioner questions or questions from the public, I want to remind everybody that this item is for information only, as well as the previous 6.1, and requires no action on our part. We do have three more items on the agenda, and we've been going about an hour and 45 minutes. And so I want to see if anybody needs to take a break, would like to take a break, or should we go ahead and charge through?
Will of the commission.
All right, I'm fine. All right, let's keep going then. So next on the agenda is item 6.3, preliminary data. And this is going to be, I believe, Helen and Joe and Sonia providing this.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. 6.3, it's all information that's already in your packet. We're just highlighting the idea that the 2010 census was based on information from, I'm sorry, the,
Put your microphone closer to you. I can't hear you.
I know.
Actually, if you go to the next slide, deviation on this particular slide is shown. This is the 2010 census population, and these are the numbers that are included in the previous map that were just shown. If you go to the next slide, it shows the differences between the districts in 2020, what the numbers would show. And as you see, District 5 is at 43,098. In 2010, it shows the numbers and then the change in those particular districts and the percentage of growth. So the deviation that we came up with was 24.3%, which is slightly different than what they said during the presentation of 64%. I don't know where that number came from, but maybe my math is wrong. I'm not sure. And this is just for information only, just to show you the difference. District 5 is grown tremendously, and there's actually growth areas in most of the districts, which is also very interesting. So again, this is just to show you what the legacy file shows as far as the information, and we'll probably lead off with these particular numbers for the 2020 to draw the draft maps.
And this is deviation from 2010 to 2020, not between the different districts themselves.
Correct. That is correct. And these numbers don't include the prison reapportionment, because we didn't receive those in time to get the packets out. So these numbers will slightly differ when we start to draw the maps.
And I also wanted to point out, when we were doing, in a couple meetings ago, when we were doing the selection of the demographer and picked flow analytics, there was an optional item in there that we called a baseline demographic assessment that we were going to pay for that was in like $8,800, $8,900 range. And so we had talked about doing that in order to be able to see the differences in what happened in District 5 and other areas of the city. After taking all this information and seeing the basic, racial subgroups as well as the growth in the various areas, we're kind of looking at that as that's not necessarily needed to be, we don't have to do that. Maybe we can save the money on doing that baseline demographic analysis by seeing there certainly was a large amount of growth. We have the information in here on the Black, Latino, and Asian populations and the differences in there also. So that's something that I also wanted to talk with the group about, is that is something that we originally had anticipated that we would do. It was a baseline demographic analysis as an optional item. But I will tell you that in the meetings that we have meetings with Flow and redistricting partners to go over some of these details. And, I'm not sure exactly what extra information the group would want beyond what we already have here, or if we still would want to do that baseline demographic analysis, which is going to show us a lot of what the same information is that we have in front of us here. So I wanted to point that out as well.
And are you suggesting we discuss whether we...
You're welcome to, it would be obviously at a future meeting that we would bring that baseline demographic analysis forward. It may look very similar to these figures right now, but it's just a deeper dive into those numbers. But what Flow Analytics was able to tell us is, here, just based on getting this info and plugging it in, I can show you just what that last slide was, show you the difference of this is what District 5 was, this is what it is now, this is how much it's changed over that 10-year period. And I think it's like an 85% increase or something like that in that district alone.
So as you see on the slide that's on your cameras or on the dais, again, this data does not include the state reallocation of prisoner population. And based on this data that we have here, the city has increased by 28,909 residents, or grown 24.3% since the last decennial census. And our growth is significantly higher than the state population change of only 6.1%. That's a big difference. And again, redistricting partners will provide adjusted data in the coming weeks and update the counts. And this item is for information only. There is no action required by the IRC.
All right. Thank you very much.
Open it up for public comment.
You'd want to open it up for public comment.
Okay. To commissioner questions first and then public comment? Okay. So if there are any commissioners who have questions about item 6.3 and the presentation from staff?
Question.
I did want to bring up something. There was some discussion about the deviation in the materials that was handed out, which I don't think they've gotten to it yet, or maybe they're not planning to today. That deviation is figured on how much higher or lower than 1/5 of the total would be. So if you look on your papers here, it kind of explains how that 63% came about, because District 5 ended up 45% over what that 1/5 would be, and District 1 was minus 16, almost 17% what 1/5 of the total would be. So you add those two together, and that's that deviation number.
I apologize. I was referring to the 2010 slide when I said I don't know how they came to that number.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the difference is growth versus deviation, right? 24.3% overall citywide growth versus a 62.3% total deviation from the ideal between districts 5 and District 1.
Right.
When those districts were drawn last year?
Yes, because they had to draw, you have to use the most recent census. So although you conducted your redistricting under a CVRA conversion last year, you used the 2010 numbers. So your districts were within 3% under the 2010 numbers, but between 2010 and 2020, you grew by 24%. So they are not within that 3% deviation any longer.
Any other questions?
I have a couple questions about the demographic data that we're talking about getting or not getting. In terms of how we get that demographic information, I understand your point about race being already broken down for us by districts, but considering we're likely going to be changing the districts so dramatically based on that 62%, would the demographic file give us more information into where pockets and maybe additional information beyond race, like renting, homeowning?
Yes, and that's the information that we're yet to receive. That'll be the voting age information, the demographics broken down per census tract. I was going to say something else. Now it just slipped my mind. But yes, we will get that data. And that data, as the maps are drawn, Redistricting Partners will, on the back of each map, will show the voting age population, the demographics, and the deviations on each particular district. And so that information will be provided. We don't yet have that.
So what is it that we're choosing not to get?
Demographic, which is very similar to what Redistricting Partners already provided us.
I gotcha.
It just shows where the growth areas are in the city of Roseville. I don't know that it includes ethnicity in that particular report. I would refer to Chris Chafee from Redistricting Partners to add or speak to that item.
So I think what we've tried to provide you with this current lines atlas, that's the back of the presentation, is that snapshot. Looking at your current lines under the total population, the 2020 legacy file. And as already noted, we are going to update those numbers with the prison reallocated data set that came out last week. So you'll have the final numbers. And what you should probably expect is adding maybe 100 people spread out, or in the 100 to 200 range, spread out throughout the city, because those are prisoners being reallocated to their former address prior to incarceration.
Chris, excuse me, when will we get the demographic information as far as the Hispanic population versus the?
It's already in that data set. It's the citizen voting age population. You can see at the bottom of page 49 or slide 49 of our just redistricting 101 presentation. The top includes, this is a legacy format, I believe. So it's the 2020 census population, and you can see that has other Latino, Asian, and Black. Okay. That's from the legacy data set under the current lines. And then the citizen voting age population, this is the one we use when we want to check for Voting Rights Act compliance. This is really the operative one. The citizen voting age population is the second kind of table on that page 49.
But this doesn't.
So these are the two data sets that are most commonly used in redistricting throughout the nation.
But this doesn't include the prisoner repopulation, correct?
Correct. So that's what we'll be updating, and it will basically be updating all of these slides with that new data set. The citizen voting age population won't change because that comes from the American Community Survey that's been out for about a year.
So, a question? Yes.
Will we be getting more granular data as far as where the different ethnic groups are located? You know, in terms of,
like heat maps of where the,
you know, if there's communities of interest that we want to keep together, how do we know where,
yes,
you know, where the ethnic groups are, basically?
So one of the mapping tools that we'll be presenting to you we'll be able to show you online where the different ethnicities reside in Roseville. We can also, if you're interested, we could provide heat maps showing Latino, Asian, African American populations within Roseville, so you can see it on an 11 by 17 page. Also, if you're interested in additional data sets other than the ethnic, there are on the census there are information about renters, homeowners, income levels, language spoken other than English, and many other data sets that we can also provide in either a heat map format or projected on your public mapping tool, or both.
And when will the overview of the public mapping tool, is that at a next?
I think that's coming up next. It's something that Flow will be providing because it's actually their tool that they've built in-house. So that will be part of, I believe, your next training. Don't quote me on that. I don't have my notes in front of me, sorry, for the training schedule.
Yeah, it'll be in October.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners? I have a question that I don't know if it was from 6.2 or 6.3, but I had forgotten about it. I think Sophia had mentioned on the timeline that there'll be a draft map provided. Who creates that draft map?
We do.
We as in the commissioners?
The public,
That's using the mapping tool.
yes, and on December 20th, I think Flow and Redistricting Partners will provide you maps. And then the Redistricting Commission will take that particular map. And I don't know, Chris, if this happens in other communities, but do you take multiple maps to the public hearing or just the map that the Redistricting Commission recommends?
So I think this is a great question. I think it really creates a great baseline for the next couple months of work. What we try to do and what Flow really tries to do, and the reason we partnered with them, is we try to follow the community of interest testimony that is heard before the commission, incorporate all the public maps that are submitted through the public mapping tool or through a napkin or a placemat or however someone draws a map. We try to incorporate those into the draft maps that we present to you, and then have a discussion that goes through those draft maps, talks through how the lines were developed and where they came from, and then allows you as the commission to kind of guide our revisions until we get to that recommended map at the end by, I think it's
December 20th.
by December 20th, with posting on the 23rd, it looks like.
Correct.
So that's really the process. And again, we really want to be here to help guide the commission, but we don't want to put our thumb on the scale and say this is where our line should be if there's not the testimony to back it. And I think the other thing to think about is that that all of you on the commission can provide community of interest testimony on how you think a line should be for the district you're representing or for the whole city. You guys are well versed in Roseville. You've all lived in the city for numerous years, and you're experts in the city of Roseville. So we'll look to you as well to help guide us as we go through this process. And again, we work for you, so we will be guided by your direction and then the direction of the public.
And when will the mapping tool go online for people to start?
October 21st.
October 21st.
Right after
Thank
the
you.
training.
For all that in the next agenda item as well with the updated schedule. If I can circle back real quick on the item that Commissioner Sweeney had a question about with the baseline demographic analysis, I just wanted to close the loop on that because that was kind of an option of something that we were trying to choose based on the delay of this information being released to us. And I went back and pulled up the actual contract of what that scope of work item would be. And it's to look and see to do an analysis to identify which areas of the city have experienced population change to help inform the Redistricting Commission and the public about population changes and what sort of estimates of areas that are going to change and could potentially change. I think we know all of that information already, and that's kind of what the point was, is that was to help fill the space in between the couple of months until we got the data. But now we have enough of that data, and as Chris mentioned, it's really only going to change by 100 people or so when we do that prisoner reallocation. So we kind of have that information already. So if anybody has other questions about that, I can help answer that. Okay.
So,
All right. Are there other questions from the commissioners?
Was it, income and age, is that information we're going to get as a regular part of what we're looking at?
Is income and age information we'll get as without the BDA, but just as our regular information?
Yeah.
Chris?
Is that a part of the information we'll be looking at?
Income and age?
That is something we can provide. It's as a supplement to our normal atlases like you've seen. We'll use median income and median age, so it's a binary on maps. If that works.
Will that cost $8,900?
No, I don't think so. I'll have to double check with Flo what the cost of median age and median income is, and I can get back to you in October. But I think we can get that information to you.
All right, I'd like to open this item up to the public if there's any questions or comments. Seeing none, we'll move to item 6.4.
Yeah, 6.4 is also a non-action item. It's just an overview of the meeting schedule and the pertinent dates coming up. There will be a total of 3 pre-map hearings, one of which is tonight. They'll all be held in the council chambers. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time reading those Gantt charts where it's just all on a solid line and you have to read sideways. So we thought we'd put a slide up showing that tonight is the first of the 3 pre-map hearings. October 25th, that is the training on the communities of interest, as well as a deeper dive on the outreach plan that is in the works, and a demonstration of the district scenario modeler that you were asking about. Then Monday, November 22nd is an opportunity for the communities of interest to provide testimony and to review, for the commission to review any maps that have been received at that point. And on Monday, December 20th, Flo will present the draft maps to the commission for consideration. Then there will be, according to our charter, it dictates that there will be 5 public hearings, 1 for each district, and that is shown on this slide. I hope you guys still like each other in January, because we're going to see a lot of each other. We'll have one on January 6th at the Mighty Community Center, January 11th, the City Council Chambers, January 13th, Mike Shelator Indoor Pool, January 18th, Martha Riley Library, and January 20th will be at St. John's Episcopal Church. And then lastly, the deadline on January 24th for the commission to adopt the final redistricting map, with the deadline for council to adopt the plan adoption.
They don't adopt.
Oh, I'm sorry, they don't? Oh. On February 1st, the city deadline for the IRC final plan adoption. Again, this is just for information only.
And if you look at the slide that has the different locations, it starts with District 1 and goes all the way down to District 5. So District 1 is held at Mighty Community Center, District 2, the Chambers, District 3, Mike Shelator Pool, District 4, Martha Riley Library, and District 5, St. John's Episcopal Church. So it's all within those particular communities or districts.
So I do have a question on that. On all of those public hearings, are we all to attend those as well? Yes. Okay.
I have a question. How is the word getting out to the public?
We're going to talk about that in the next item in our outreach plan.
Okay.
Any other questions at this point? On February 1st, that's a meeting of ours? But so I'm a little confused. So we adopt the final map on the 24th of January, but then it says we meet again on the 1st of February.
On the 1st of February, you'll memorialize everything, the plan and the maps. We do have an alternate date that we can use if we don't come to agreement on the January date. I think 31st is the following Monday. If everything works well, this timeline is great, but there may be an occasion where you all can't decide on the map and we have to meet again. So we've worked that in. February 1st would be great because, again, as I've told you before, we open up candidate filings on February 8th, and they need to know what district they're in by then.
And I'm sorry, what's the difference between adopting the final redistricting map and adopting the final plan?
Chris, do you want to speak to the plan? I think he's on there
What's the
anymore.
difference between the map and the plan?
The plan will talk about the pros and cons of the map that was adopted. It'll outline how the commission came to choose that particular map. And what that is it's a formal document that you'll provide to the city council saying, this is the map we've adopted, and this is why we adopted this map.
And that goes to council, and then council does what?
Council has to accept the map. There may be a formal process in which they have to do that, but they cannot make any changes to the map that you adopt and bring forward to them. The only change that could particularly happen is if a referendum was filed against the document, and that's why there is a 30-day wait period from the time that the map and the plan is adopted until we can actually physically use that.
Julia?
So these might already be set in stone, but I'm curious if we want to make an effort to have at least one public hearing not be on a weekday at 6 p.m. if there are people that want to participate and that traditional time doesn't work for them.
Well, right now it's set in stone thus far. We've got meeting reservations for the particular locations.
Could we add one?
Excuse me?
Could we add one on a weekend?
We could.
That's something we would discuss at a later time.
Yes.
Okay, because that's something that I think would be nice, if people are just getting home from work or if they are working late at night, they might not be able to, participate.
And if someone who lives in one district can't make it to that scheduled date, they can go to a date in another district.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll open it up to public questions on 6.4. Anyone from the public have any questions? All right, then we'll move on to, again, this is a non-action item. We'll move to our final item, 6.5, Community Engagement Plan.
So if you would refer to the document that you have in your packet, it is the Community Engagement Plan. This was formulated and prepared by Taylor Hodges of Flow Analytics and Brian Jacobson, our City of Roseville Public Information Officer. If you look on the slide, and I believe that you have these PowerPoint in front of you, this is the logo that we're going to use on all public outreach information. There are different formats that we'll use on different forms of information, but I just wanted to make you aware that we do have a logo. So any document that goes out regarding redistricting will be recognized by this particular logo. So the goals of the community engagement plan would be, of course, to engage the Roseville community and broadly to ensure an inclusive, interactive, and transparent redistricting process. We want to educate and inform the community members and the key stakeholders about the process, including how to submit the maps, which we'll talk about in the October meeting. We'll show the district modeler and how to use that particular tool. Again, as Chris said, people can submit maps now. They can draw them out on a placemat, on a piece of paper, anything that if they have a vision of what they want that map to look like, we can accept it now without even using the computer tool for that. So the audiences will be all community members living in the city of Roseville. The media, the Press Tribune, Roseville Today, which is a website based communication. And then in West Roseville and Sun City, they have their own neighborhood newspapers. So we'll make sure that all the information gets out to them on when the public hearings are, what the proposed draft map looks like. We also will engage the Roseville Coalition of Neighborhood Associations, the Chambers of Commerce, and include the Roseville Area Chamber of Commerce, the Latino Leadership Council, the Sikh Temple, and the Invest Health Partnership. So there's a little message about the decennial census and then what the Redistricting Commission, what the community involvement we'd like to see. If you look at the communication calendar, this evening, it was September 21st. We did develop the logo, which you have before you, and we published the webpage. That'll have all the agendas for the hearings, a calendar of all meetings, hearings, archived videos of all the meetings, all presentation material and handouts, and all complete and draft final maps being considered by the committee will be included on that page. And an email address for direct public inquiries or comment submissions. That'll be the city clerk's department. And then community of interest, testimony resources. I heard tonight that maybe we need to develop a template that people can submit their community of interest testimony if they don't want to attend the meetings and make a presentation on that. The late September, early October, there'll be a news release that goes out to the Press Tribune and Roseville Today. And the census data will be released, the complete data. The link to the redistricting page will be solicited as well, so people know where to go. And the link to the district scenario modeler tool, which is how you draw the maps online, will be released in early September or October. In late September, early October, there'll be a city news bureau story on the website talking about the process overview, the census data, the link to the redistricting webpage, and the link to the district scenario modeler tool. Then we'll also be doing an e-newsletter update, again, including the overview, the census data, the upcoming public hearings, the link to the redistricting webpage, and the link to the districting scenario model. In late September, early October, post to social media channels. In October 11th, we're going to do a utility bill insert mailer that explains the process and outlines all the dates. Through the mailing of the citywide mailer should reach everyone's mailboxes late October through November. In mid-December, we'll do another City News Bureau on the website about the upcoming hearings, again to remind them of the January dates. And then we'll send all that information to the West Roseville Sun City News for early publication in January. Again, another newsletter update. And we I don't know if any of you received, when we were going through the charter review process, the mailer that was sent to you that outlined the different changes. We're going to send a mailer similar to that as well. So not only will you get it in your utility bill insert information on how to partake in the process, but we'll also send out a nice glossy 8.5 by 11, or maybe a postcard size, depending on what our Public Affairs and Communications Department recommends goes out. And then 5 days in advance, we'll do the public notice and the notice of hearing. And then we've got some other dates, social media post, the City News Bureau. We'll update the IRC redistricting webpage with the presentations, handouts, and public comments. And another e-newsletter, another social media post, and then after the public hearings occur in January, we'll update the webpage with the presentations, handouts, and public comments. And then hopefully we'll have a map adopted at the end of January. So this will be posted on the city website as well. And Brian Jacobs is here. He's our Public Information Officer if you have any specific questions regarding the communications plan. Standing in the back of the room.
Thank you, Sonia. Are there any questions from commissioners on the outreach plan?
I have a question. Right now on the city's website, the schedule that you gave to us earlier is posted on there for the
Correct.
public to go to. Is that the same place where the other information is going to be? Is there going to be a separate website just for like the mapper?
No, it'll all be on the same page.
One place, okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
And what is the address for the redistricting website?
Address?
Like, is it?
City Clerk Roseville at roseville.ca.us, and I believe that's City of Roseville /redistricting, correct?
Correct. Actually, we have two short URLs for the website, so /redistricting and /IRC for your commission. So either one will get you to the page.
Just out of curiosity, how wide do you go with the social media channels? Do you do things like Facebook and Nextdoor?
We have Facebook, Twitter, Nextdoor, Instagram. We're also starting TikTok. So we'll be seeing what kind of folks we get participating from that outreach. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize on this, I mean, there's a lot of dates here, but this will be an ongoing process. There's not going to be on November 3rd, we're going to do a social media post. This will be ongoing several times between now and to the end of the process, including our e-newsletters, which go out every week to 50,000 residents. So there will be no shortage of information that'll be sent out to folks.
This is more just a comment because we were talking about, outreach earlier. I really appreciate the plans here and the dates and everything we're going to do, because I did go back and just check the city calendar for like our June 28th meeting, and while it was posted online, it wasn't on the calendar. So like I went and I just checked and
We'll
verify.
make sure that the calendar's updated.
Yeah, so if all of the spots, because I didn't want to seem like, it was out of nowhere, because we're getting comments on things not being posted. I wanted to verify that.
But we did show you that they were actually posted, so.
For September, but on June 28th when we had action.
Yeah, we didn't have a web page then.
Yeah.
We hadn't developed it yet. Yeah.
No, just the city calendar is the place I always go. So I love that it's all posted on there now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other ideas or questions?
I do, as always. I'm concerned about phone numbers, about with some people not being able to attend, will they be able to call in to make comments? Will a number be provided for these public hearings?
Take that before the executive team, who've made the decision that they were going to discontinue the phone number because the meetings were open to the public. So I will raise that question to them. I don't assume that they're going to say no, but that will require an additional staff member to be in the back answering the phones.
Would that, would it not be a Brown Act violation if you do not provide a call-in number?
Since the meetings are open to the public, then everyone is able to comment here. By having the phone number available, that is an extra, additional step that Sonia said that she would be able to check in on. And everyone is always able to submit emails or, written comments at any time. It doesn't have to be at the meeting time specifically either.
Yeah, it is. Like Julia, I'm a little bit concerned with them all being 6 o'clock in the evening, because there are people for whom that would be difficult.
Well, we wanted that for consistency, so people know that the meetings are at 6 p.m. If we start skipping around to 4:30, 6, 7:30, it gets confusing for the public.
So do we as the IRC have the authority to request something go on the agenda and make a motion that we would like the phone number to be, or do we only get to request that staff take it up and let us know if we're allowed to?
I think you should let staff first take a charge of that. If you're not happy with the results, we can write a staff report to the city council to have them dictate that. But at this point, we'll go to the executive team and see if they authorize the use of the phone.
Yeah.
Again, it's for consistency purposes.
Because specifically for the communities of interest testimony on November 22nd, that seems like the big one. We want to hear from everybody. Right. So maybe we could even, in the next meeting, make a decision as this commission to say, we as this commission recognize it's a different setup from the other ones, but for this, we want to have it.
I would point out, too, that this commission is not like the other commissions where they meet all year this commission will be done after April, and this commission will not meet for another 10 years, and it won't even be the same commission. So we're making decisions based on something that's now, and people are going to get one chance, maybe, to say something. And if they don't have a chance to call in, to me, that's just wrong.
I agree with you.
I mean, hopefully they would take that into consideration, and it's not the same as every other commission. I understand consistency. Keep it simple.
I've got my marching orders. I know what to ask. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Are there any pros and cons to doing something with Sacramento Bee or some of the TV stations? Would they do a story on this? Because I know I read the Bee, I watch TV. I don't necessarily read.
We can certainly reach out to them, but everybody's doing redistricting. Placer County, the state, every city, every county. So I don't know what Roseville's story would be any different from any of those others that would cause the Bee or the Sacramento TV stations to get involved or promote our particular redistricting program. And of course, they reach many people who would not be interested in our redistricting at all. So they take that into consideration, but I can certainly reach out to them.
Or it might reach people that will come to ours who live in Elk Grove or somewhere else.
Well, another consideration that we have is that the school districts are now going through redistricting. NDC is actually doing their redistricting. So, again, consistency, 6 p.m. Mondays, just because we don't want to confuse the public on the school district redistricting versus our own electoral district redistricting. So.
Which is one of the reasons we created the logo. So we had kind of an identifier for our Roseville City Council redistricting, and it didn't get confused with all the other redistricting that's going on.
And my next question was going to be outreach to students, if that would be something we would want to do. But again, I understand the confusing nature of that. But
we can certainly reach out to
their parents to come.
Sure, we can certainly reach out to the high school students, and just from a civics lesson perspective, and if then they bring it home to their parents or share it with their parents, or if they're 18.
They're 16 because they can register to vote to have it take automatic effect when they turn 18.
So we can absolutely add that to the plan.
Nothing wrong with it, piquing their interest at least.
Yeah, I did notice that the logo looks surprisingly similar to the Placer County redistricting logo.
Well, it includes a map, which is theirs has a map as well.
Yeah.
We tried to make it a little bit different. Theirs particularly had a pencil, so we avoided the pencil, and we used some different verbiage. But it does have some similarities. I mean, we're talking about redistricting. There's only so many ways you can kind of show that. But we tried to do something that was uniquely Roseville.
If there are no more questions from the commissioners, is there any questions or comments from the public on item 6.5?
Lisa Larkin again, Roseville. I just wanted to reiterate, I had a friend who texted me and called the number that you put up on the screen and nobody answered, so.
Yeah, we don't have the phone out here.
Right, that's what I'm saying. You said there was a number for people to call in, but then there really wasn't, so.
Lisa, at the next meeting, we'll have a number to call in.
Appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, again, this is a non-action item. So the next item would be adjournment. Is there any further business from the commission that anyone would like to bring up at this time?
Question, do you want me to propose the weekend meeting and then bring back an updated schedule? We meet with redistricting partners tomorrow, and again, I'll have to make sure that they can attend the meeting, the public hearing on a weekend as well.
What are the other, I'd like to hear from other commissioners as well, if they would like to have another meeting that's on a weekend.
I would like to have another meeting, but I'm also concerned, is that going to add to the budget that we've already set? Because I think we could set a budget for 5. Now we would have 6, and then they'd have to come up. How much is that going to affect?
Well, what I can do is make that proposal and then let you know what the cost would be.
And I could tell you that what we did with when we took the item to council, it had a not to exceed number, and by us maybe pulling away from that baseline demographic analysis, we did not do a change order or anything to officially pull it out in the event there was another meeting or some other action that resulted in, an expense, so that we could still have that money in there in the budget. So
Yeah, I would rather not have a baseline, but have an added meeting.
Sure.
Well, and we may have another added meeting if you don't come to final adoption in January. We may have to have a meeting on the 31st as well.
All right.
Which all of those meetings, the public is encouraged to attend, all of them. And if you
So
want to
you-
come to 5 public hearings, and you live in one district, you can come to all 5.
So you're going to ask the demographers about a weekend meeting and what that will entail,
Right.
and then come back with us with a report on that.
Correct. But the question is which district do we hold the weekend meeting in?
I have a follow-up on that. So if you do one in a district, must you do 4 others on the weekend as well to satisfy that? Or do you hold it here?
Yeah.
If it's available, and then it's,
Can go to any of the locations.
I completely understand, but someone who would walk to a meeting on a weekend from their home may not want to drive to one, just saying.
Yeah. Yeah, I think your point of this would be the most neutral location. And I think if we're just adding input on this, I think it would be nice to have it like towards the tail end of January after we've done initial outreach to each of the districts. It's kind of like a last call in a neutral environment.
I'd also be agreeable to that too, because I think having it here in a central location is good. This is like the heart of Roseville, right? And convenient for everybody. Yeah, so that's fine.
Christine?
Yeah, I don't know if this is I don't know where my microphone is. I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I think it's more a question for Sonia. But it seems to me, having served on several other commissions, that for a long time, these commissions were held at 7 o'clock at night, and there was so much public feedback that was way too late for people. So really, the turning back to 6 p.m. was really in response to, it seemed to me, if I'm correct, public response.
Correct. Yeah, people let us know that they would prefer the meetings earlier at night.
Especially in the winter when it
Yes.
gets dark really early.
Yeah, I'm definitely not advocating Saturday night. More like a Saturday day.
Has there been much outcry is too strong of a word, but inquiries from the public that, hey, there should be more public meetings on weekends, just in general, never mind just this commission, but anything else?
Been a few of the alternative transportation meetings on the weekend when they were planning the trails, but I don't know of any other commission that has met on a Saturday. Even the Citizens Redistricting Commission, the CRC, about the Measure B thing, I don't think they met on a weekend. It was totally during weekdays. I'm not opposed to meeting on a weekend, it's just.
Well, in my 21 years, I've never heard of anyone wanting to meet on the weekends, but that's just me. One thing I did want to point out is I don't believe that we would have the capability at the public hearings for phone-in. I don't think that that's an option because we'll be in a remote location.
So
For the one that's here.
Yeah.
in the outreach material, then, can we encourage or emphasize that they can email beforehand?
Yes.
They can call the city clerk's office with any
Yeah, that's
comments
in
or
there.
questions beforehand?
Yes,
And
it's
then
in
those
there
questions will be read at the meeting, and then
Correct.
they don't actually have to be there.
But why not? Like, why? I just feel like after COVID, we've gotten so good at conference calls and things. Like, why wouldn't you be able to have a phone in?
Brian?
Brian? They're asking why we can't have a phone-in call number at our remote locations. Can you explain the technical issues with that?
I don't know the answer to that. If we could or we couldn't, we'd have to look into it. It may be possible, but I'd have to check.
Yeah, because the phone line is in this particular room.
But one consideration, those meetings as of now are not going to be live streamed, so anybody calling in wouldn't necessarily hear it. When we have the meetings now, when people call in, they can hear the meeting ongoing over our live stream on YouTube or on the city website. The 5 meetings that we're not going to be in the council chambers, we're not planning on live streaming those, so there's not an audio feed for them to listen to throughout the meeting as of this time.
So can we make sure that those public hearings, public meetings, there's a note somewhere that it says this will not be accessible, so you would have to
Attend the meeting.
attend the meeting?
Or submit comments prior to the meeting to be read.
Right, and then maybe
into
if
the
we
record.
have that Saturday, if we're allowed that, then
We're back here
back here, then you
with the
can
phone.
call in.
Yeah.
If I might, one other consideration about changing dates and times. We do have some deadlines for the mailers that will happen before the next meeting that you have. So if we want to have those dates and times in the mailer, those decisions need to be made by the middle of the month, if we want that to be accurate. And of course, things change. We can, certainly provide outreach if those things change, but just so you know, that's a consideration from our side.
So do we have consensus of the group that we want a Saturday meeting?
Is there a motion to have a Saturday meeting?
No.
We can't
wasn't
take
an
an action
agenda
on.
Not an action, just shake your head if you're for a Saturday meeting.
I'm not opposed to it. I think it's maybe a little excessive, but if there was ever a time to be excessive, this is it. So I'm not going to be opposed to it.
Can we find out what the availability is of the demographers for a Saturday meeting first?
Yeah, I'll have to check
We're
with
gonna do
that
that
too.
anyway.
But in order to do that, I need to make sure that it's a group consensus that we want to meet on a Saturday before I go and do that research, and then we decide we're not going to do that. So you want to show me your hands instead of shaking your head. Do you want a Saturday meeting? Okay, consensus for a Saturday meeting.
Okay, thank you.
And I just may determine that meeting date because it has to be determined prior to the mailer going out.
And prior to the next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
As one other quick question before we close, what is Invest Health Partnership?
Ryan?
Are there any organizations for the African American community, for Asian community in Roseville?
We could certainly expand the audiences we have in here. This is a living document, so it'll be continually updated and changed as we see fit and as we see needed. Invest Health is a local group of that really focuses on the core neighborhoods and the health and well-being of the core neighborhoods. So they're very ingrained in those areas, and so we want to talk with them, get them engaged in this process, and help them spread the word in some of the older core neighborhoods of the city.
Seek a motion to adjourn.
I'll motion we adjourn.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Meeting is adjourned until
October 25th.
October 25th. Thank you.